Good afternoon. It's so fantastic to see so many of you come out today to hear about our wonderful project. Thanks very much. I'm Judy Montgomery. I'm the Associate Librarian, and I'll serve as moderator this evening. In 1908, self-taught botanist and painter Kate Furbish, a resident of Brunswick, Maine, donated her monumental Flora of Maine to Bowdoin College. These 14 scrapbooks volumes, consisting of 1,326 watercolors and pencil sketches arranged by plant family, and 2 additional volumes of mushrooms, were the culmination of her work of over her 30-year quest to collect, classify, and paint the flowering plants of Maine. Her aim was scientific, to represent the plants in their true size and color, often depicting different states of the same plant observed at different times of year. But those examining the paintings cannot help but be struck by her artistic technique and the beauty of each image. Today marks our Bowdoin launch of Plants and Flowers of Maine, Kate Furbish's Watercolors, a new book published by Rowman Littlefield and Bowdoin College Library in collaboration with the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. To mark the occasion, we have invited 3 people, each of whom has played a pivotal role in helping to realize our dream to bring Kate Furbish and her exquisite watercolors to the attention of a wider audience to share their thoughts with you. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the remarks. We would also like to acknowledge the importance of an earlier book, Kate Furbish and the Flora of Maine, written by Ida and Frank Graham and published by Tilbury Press in 1995. I believe the Grahams are here with us today. Is that true? Thank you. This wonderful biographical work inspired those of us at Bowdoin to, with the help of advanced digital technology, capture and publish our beautiful facsimile version of Kate Furbish's botanical portraits. In addition, I would like to thank several people for the role they played in the publication of the new volume. Michael Steer, who's the editorial director of Down East Books, Kat Stefko and Marika van der Steenhoven from Bowdoin Special Collections and Archives, Sherry Bergman, Director Emeritus of the Bowdoin College Library, Crystal Collins-Judd, who was Dean for Academic Affairs during much of the project, Marjorie Hassan, Bowdoin's current Director of Libraries, and 4 Bowdoin students who worked on the project: Joseph Celestine, class of 15, Brian Francoeur, class of 16, Carolina Day Felt Strez, class of 16, and Laura Hernandez, class of 2017. I think Laura may be here somewhere today. And of course, our wonderful speakers, Jed Lyons, Melissa Cullina, and Richard Linderman, who you'll hear from very soon. Directly following our presentation, we hope you will join us on the 2nd floor of Hawthorne-Longfellow Library for a reception and an opening of a new exhibit, Botanizing America. The exhibit celebrates the Furbish publication and contextualizes the work by tracing the history of botany through the 19th century America, both as it was practiced by professional scientists and amateur botanizers. Bowdoin's botanical holdings, as you will see in the exhibition, are particularly strong, no doubt due to botany's prominent place in the curriculum of the college and the Medical School of Maine, which existed at Bowdoin for most of the 19th century. Bowdoin is fortunate to hold many of the landmark botanical publications of the century, and these, along with Furbish's original watercolors, form the basis of the exhibit. Almost done. Copies of Plants and Flowers of Maine and Furbish note cards are available in the lobby in the back of the auditorium, and they'll be available at the reception as well. You can also purchase the book in future from the Bowdoin bookstore or directly from Rowman and Littlefield. Before we begin, I'd like to thank some of the people that made this event possible. You all know how much time and effort it takes. They are Helen Hill, Michelle McDonough, Marika van der Steenhoven, Kat Stefko, Bowdoin students Julio Cesar Palacio and Laura Hernandez, and Bowdoin's events and AV services, facilities, and dining service. Thanks to everyone. Now let me introduce our first speaker. Jed Lyons is the president and CEO of Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group, Incorporated in Lanham, Maryland. Is that right, Jed? Lanham? Lanham, Maryland. Rowman and Littlefield publishes approximately 2,200 new books annually under the imprints of Rowman and Littlefield, Lexington Books, Derrydale Press, Down East Books, Globe Pequot, Falcon Guides, Lions Press, Two Dot, Government Institutes, Taylor Trade, Bernan, Sundance Newbridge, and others. Jed also serves as CEO of the National Book Network Incorporated, a distributor of independent publishers which Rowman and Littlefield launched in 1986. NBN International, the UK distributor that Rowman and Littlefield purchased in 2003, serves 150 client publishers in Plymouth, England. Now, Jed graduated from Bowdoin in class of 1974, and you're going to hear more about that, I believe. And his son graduated from Bowdoin in 2006. Jed has served as a member of the International Board of Directors of the Young Presidents Organization, YPO, as a member of the board of the Washington National Cathedral, and as a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Jed lives in Washington, D.C. So join me in welcoming Jed.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Judy. This project would never have happened without your support, and I really do appreciate your enthusiasm, and it has been such a pleasure to work with you. This really has been a labor of love. I can't tell you how happy I am to be back in Maine, and especially back at Bowdoin. When I came here for the first time from Illinois as a high school senior in 1969, I remember coming to Maine for the first time and coming onto the campus like yesterday. I can remember the smell of the pine trees, the clear, crisp air. We didn't have that in Illinois. The incredible blue water and this rocky coastline. It was such a privilege to be here. I decided immediately I would go to Bowdoin. I applied early. Luckily, I was admitted, and I never looked back. Brainwashed both of my sons to go to Bowdoin. One did. We're working on his son now. He's only 1 year old, so we're going to give him another year. My other son, unfortunately, went to Amherst. Didn't have nearly as good a time at Bowdoin. One thing I remember about my first trip here was in June. It was still cool. And I walked into the Molten Union and looked to the right, and in that room, that great, beautiful room where the piano is, there was a fire burning, and there was a polar bear skin, and with head attached. And I thought, this place is so cool. I'm going to really like it here. And I did. I thought I would start with a photograph. It was our senior year. That's me in the middle. On the right is Merv Smith, who was my roommate freshman year. The Bowdoin Admissions Office, which was being run for the first time that year, I think, by Dick Mall, wanted to have a class with pizzazz, as he termed it. And up until then, Hubie Shaw had been admitting students who were quite a bit different, more conservative and more traditional. And our class of pizzazz was full of characters. And Merv was the 13th child of a carpenter from Trinidad who came on scholarship from Washington, D.C., where he graduated from high school. And we became fast friends, and I was the best man at his wedding. He married Tom Waite's sister. That was his first wife. And they got married in a park in Boston, and for some reason, he loved Kahlil Gibran, and we all had to endure Kahlil Gibran. During the ceremony, Merv got so emotional he couldn't complete his vows. He was weeping, and I thought to myself, what a sap I have for a roommate. Anyway, he went on to become a doctor, and he's now a general physician working in Michigan. On the left, on the right, on my left, is my roommate, Spiros Dragidis, who I'm happy to say is here tonight with his wife, Adelie. Spiros was the president of our class. He was... Stand up, Spiros. There he is. Spiros was the president of our class, first-generation son of immigrants who ran the Wonder Bar Diner in Biddeford, Maine. And Spiros has just retired from a distinguished career in the federal government and moved back to Biddeford. I'm trying to convince him to run for mayor. He is here with his wife, Adelie. So let's go to the next slide. Do I do that? Oh. Okay, I'm not sure I know how. Push this. Sorry about that, folks.
This one on the right.
Okay. So here's the admissions team. I just thought I'd give you a flavor. Don Westfall is here. Don, you stand up. Don was the editor of the Bowdoin Orient. He's here with his daughter. I worked for Don. He was a real taskmaster, I could tell you. But this is a cartoon that I did at Bowdoin. That's Dick Mall on the right, Dick Boyden in the middle. And does anyone recognize the guy on the left? Merce Rowe. Okay. This is a typical, we saw a lot of students who looked like this in 1970. That was a popular look. That one too. That's the old faculty fart. Oh, wait a minute. There's the preppy. There weren't too many of those back then. There are probably more now. That's the parasitic hibernating bookworm. And I had to finish with a shot of my very close friend, Chris Potholm, on the right, who's here tonight. Where are you, Chris? There he is. Chris was my mentor. We worked on the Cohen campaign together, and he agreed, along with Dick Morgan on the left, to go into the gold in the halftime between periods of a hockey game and have students who paid money take shots at him in the goal to raise money for the college's bicentennial. Anyway, Bowdoin was a very special place back then. It still is now. We all love this place dearly. And I think I see Annie Ireland, and she was my Psi-U sister. Welcome. Stand up. You got to say hello too. Very nice to see the Grants here. I really enjoyed reading your book. So let me just give you my reaction to Kate Furbish. When I was at college back in the 70s, I remember sneaking into the rare book room and seeing these paintings and being amazed at how beautiful they were. It occurred to me then that she really was the James Audubon of Maine. The quality of the paintings, as you've seen if you looked at them, is really superb, and yet she lived, I think, a very lonely life. It's very poignant and moving to think about how this woman spent her entire life traipsing around the state, literally crawling on her stomach to get to species. She probably knew the state better than anyone at the time. She literally covered the entire state with her painting and drawing equipment, and she would take specimens back home and paint them in her studio. But the trick of getting them in the first place was what made her so intrepid and brave. She did all of this over the course of 40 years and never married. She was a really remarkable artist, in addition to being a remarkable amateur botanist. She never got credit for doing either of those things. And I always thought it would be nice to see if we could publish these. And when we started talking to Judy and Richard Lindemann about the project, we realized that we had to do her paintings justice by reproducing them full size. And that is why the books are so big. Each of the paintings is reproduced exactly as you would see it if you were looking at it. That's why the oversized folio. We got beautiful digitized images from the college. We had a very high quality printer in Asia do the printing. It took about 2 months to get the books here because they weigh so much and they had to be sent by sea rather than by air. Each of them weighs 37 pounds, the 2 books together. So it was quite a shock when I got the first dummy and realized how big this book was and how much it was going to cost to print. That was a real shock. But there's been a lot of enthusiasm for it, and I hope that all of you will get a chance to see it this evening. There's one outside, and there'll be others at the library tonight. Just a couple of other things about Bowdoin back in the day. Herbert Ross Brown, many of you remember Herbie Brown. He taught English, and he was just one of my favorite professors. I'll never forget when he broke his hip slipping on the ice. He conducted our Shakespeare classes from his bed in his bedroom. Another of my favorites was Larry Hall, who, as many of you know, was a great writer. He won the O. Henry Prize for Best Short Story, The Ledge. He went on to have a distinguished teaching career here. I was in a senior year class of just 3 of us. He was teaching Moby Dick, and often he would have a snoot full and couldn't quite make it to the classroom, so we'd go out to his office, or to his home, and he would teach there. That probably doesn't happen today. Maybe it does, I don't know. Roger Howell. Roger was a great guy. We had a lot of fun with him, and we always had a bottle of Usher's available at the Sayou House just in case he came by for one of our parties, as he often did. That was also a different time and a more innocent time. He was a wonderful guy. Chris and Sandy Potholm, my very close friends for so many years, we all arrived at Bowdoin in 1970, and I was a freshman, and I walked up to this beautiful girl, and I asked her for a date, and she said, "Well, I'm married to Professor Potholm." So, oh well, okay. I think I have a class with Professor Potholm in about 2 hours. But I saw Sandy tonight. She's just as beautiful as ever. And Chris is absolutely a great friend of Bowdoin, a brilliant scholar, a great writer, and it means a lot to me, Chris, that you're here tonight. Thank you. So, again, it's a privilege to be here, and let me introduce Richard Lindemann now, who was instrumental in making this book happen. Richard?
It is my very deep pleasure to introduce my very good friend, colleague, and co-conspirator, Richard Lindemann. Richard is Director Emeritus of the George J. Mitchell Department of Special Collections and Archives at Bowdoin, having retired in 2015. Before coming to Bowdoin in 1999, he held librarian and archival positions at the University of California, San Diego, the University of Virginia, and Emory University. His career has been devoted to acquiring, preserving, and promoting free and public access to rare books, manuscripts, and related scholarly resources. And he is an early adopter of digitizing special collections materials in order to make them more widely available on the internet. His publication projects have ranged widely from a Dr. Seuss bibliography to the edited memoirs of Civil War General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Most recently, he managed the digitization of the Kate Furbish collection and served as editor for that publication. Richard?
Thank you. I'm going to figure this out in a minute. There we go. We're starting black tonight. Jed, I wanted to thank you first for being such a wonderful partner in our project. For us, it was a perfect match made in heaven, so I think it turned out well too, don't you? Over the next few minutes, I'd like to share a little bit of what it has taken to bring Kate Furbish's vibrant plant portraits, which she titled Maine Flora, to the facsimile full-size edition that we celebrate this afternoon. But first, I also want to acknowledge others, in addition to Jed, who have been essential in making that book. You're going to get tired of these names, but they mean so much to us. We wanted to take the opportunity publicly to acknowledge them. The Bowdoin College Philip D. Crockett Fund and the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens for funding support. Bill, I think, is not here yet. Is that right? Is Bill here? So I'll thank you instead, Melissa. Judy Montgomery, who's been ferocious in pushing our agenda forward. I was trying to think, Judy, were you actually technically my boss when all this was going on? Although I don't really ever think I have a boss, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway, Marika van der Steenhoven, who has been infinitely patient with me as we plotted through the challenging exercise of deciphering and enhancing Furbish's captions. Where is Marika? She's around here somewhere. Maybe she's out smoking a cigarette, I don't know. And Melissa Cullina, ever enthusiastic about promoting Furbish's work, whose sage counsel and botanic expertise vastly improve the accuracy of more synonymous identifications than I care to admit in public. Melissa, thank you for that. And thank you for writing the introduction to the book. We in libraries sit on a three-legged stool when we get a chance to sit at all. Acquiring information resources, preserving them, and making them accessible are our three core functions. Concerning Furbish's monumental collection of botanic illustrations, and I do mean monumental, we all know now they are 2 feet high each, 16 huge volumes with over 1,300 watercolors and some pencil sketches, as well as several hundred mushroom illustrations. The acquisition was easy enough. Furbish gifted the artwork to Bowdoin in 1908. The mushrooms often seem to get short shrift. Furbish noted them as addenda to her paintings of flowering plants and conifers, and they are excluded from the book, so I'll let you look at this seldom seen rendering for a while. For Furbish's volumes, the other two legs of the stool have been a little shakier, due mainly to the size of the collection and the inherent fragility of the volumes themselves. Furbish mounted her artwork onto thick paper on which she also pasted specimen labels that identified the plant, provided locations where it was observed and in which year, and sometimes revised or updated taxonomies when she determined them. Although the watercolors remained vibrant, the papers, the glues, even the binding structure that encased each volume all had started to fail with the passage of time due to various causes. Acidity, physical handling, and the bulk of each volume being principal among them. So in the early 1980s, the college began to conserve the Furbish volumes. Diane Gutcher, are you here? I think you started that, did you not? Yes, I think so too. Diane Gutcher was my predecessor. The college began to conserve the Furbish volumes one by one, contracting with what is now named the Northeast Document Conservation Center to repair the binding, deacidify papers, clean the surface of the artwork, and remove harmful adhesives. In essence, to make each volume whole again, but with materials that would be less likely to self-destruct over time. During that decade, 2 volumes were conserved at a cost of roughly $4,000 to $6,000 a volume. Over the years, 3 more volumes received similar treatment, each at staggeringly increased cost, though, so that the most recent bill for a conserved volume in 2010 was over $32,000. With 5 volumes down and 11 to go, it became increasingly evident that completing the task anytime soon would be far beyond our reach. And so we began instead to redirect funds toward accomplishing an interim digital preservation project that would capture the essence of Furbish's work at very high resolution. This would ensure the enduring survival of all of the Maine flora volumes in at least a digital form. At the same time, we began compiling transcriptions of Furbish's labels into a database that would facilitate indexing the volumes, but also with the further goal of providing access to digital surrogates of the images once those were created. Coincidentally and fortuitously, Jed Lyons approached the college in 2012 with his own idea for a published version of Maine Flora. Since we at Bowdoin were determined to digitize the collection anyway, and because those images could serve as the source for producing a facsimile publication as well, we were obviously intrigued. And over the next 2 years, both Bowdoin and Rowman Littlefield came to a shared enthusiasm for a full-size facsimile edition of Furbish's work. In 2014, the college realized sufficient funds to digitize the volumes, and as publication plans moved forward, the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens joined our partnership by generously agreeing to contribute towards production costs. In addition, the garden's Director of Education and Staff Botanist, Melissa Cullina, from whom you will hear soon, graciously agreed to provide an introduction for the book. The rest, as they say, is history. But history, like this slide, isn't always pretty. In digitizing the images, we relied on vendors who performed superbly, but each image file is huge, around 280 megabytes each, so we needed lots of storage, and every image required tweaking and reformatting. Remember, there are over 1,300 of these. A greater challenge was transcribing Furbish's labels, researching taxa synonyms, and attempting corresponding common names for plants that she had illustrated. Furbish had, over the span of nearly 4 decades, relied heavily and progressively on the 5th, 6th, and 7th editions of Gray's Manual, occasionally equivocating about her identifications. This slide shows a table of contents from one of the volumes, on which she indicates that Gray's Manual, 6th edition, is the source for her taxonomies. So up there you see the 6th edition up there, and a little note at the bottom. Each of the volumes has this kind of title page to it or a table of contents, and almost all of them provide that scientific information, but not all of them are from the 6th edition. Ultimately, in 1908, Furbish welcomed the aid of her longtime acquaintance, Harvard botanist and taxonomist Merritt Lyndon Fernald, to assist her in revisiting many of her assignations. Just before donating the volumes to Bowdoin, and just after Gray's then latest edition, the 7th, which Fernald had helped to revise and edit, was published. To accomplish the transcribing, we initially hired student botany majors, and we relied mainly on Arthur Haynes's Flora Novae Angliae, recently published at that time, I think 2011, as our guide to track each of the images' current scientific names. We quickly discovered, by the way, that our students' ability to read cursive was a much higher premium than their botanic expertise. As an aside, I hope we have time for asides. As an aside, I will say that as increasingly in my career, as we brought students in and gave them manuscripts, said, here, what are you going to make out of this? What is this historical thing about? We couldn't get very far in the conversation because they couldn't read the handwriting. So it's a problem. In more than a few instances, additional manuals and flora were required to trace archaic names to their current taxa. Our special thanks to Marika and Melissa for their tireless efforts in sleuthing many of those vexing synonyms. So here's a typical page from Maine Flora. The labels show taxa, place names, cite the source, and record revisions as plant names change due to reclassification. Here's a detail from that page where the labels show how the taxon changed over time. The one on the right was written first, and then she added information on the one on the left to reflect the name change. Occasionally, she might also add a little editorial comment here and there, such as this one pertaining to the Highbush Blueberry. It reads, "This plant was 6 feet high, abundant in a bog." This is the accompanying watercolor. Many of us have them in our backyards. Or this example of a fugitive plant that she found only once and never managed to identify. It reads, and y'all can work on your cursive too here now. I gathered this little fragment with other plants on the sandy shore of a pond in South Poland in '95. I returned twice to look it up, but was disappointed, for I looked in vain. As in another aside, one of the students transcribed South Poland as South Portland. We had a lot of fun with this project. This is the full drawing. You can see how tiny the little thing is. Close up, it looks like this, with a question mark at the foot of the illustration. Melissa has kindly made the identification for this plant. Here's another, a violet, that shows revisions made in 1908, in this case by Fernald. You can see a close-up of that and his initials MLF on the left-sided label. The page also exemplifies the myriad occasions in Maine flora where Furbish applied her labels directly onto the corresponding drawing or painting. The label that is credited with Fernald's knowledge seems to me to be written in Furbish's hand. So it's a little puzzling the extent to which Fernald was actually engaged in helping her with the taxonomies. And further research, I think, might present some interesting findings in that regard. To offer a more pleasing presentation for the facsimile edition, we digitally restored those drawings to their original state by editing out the overlain labels. So on the left is what you see in the bound volumes, and on the right, with caption off the image, is what you find in the book. So I hope you can see that Plants and Flowers of Maine is a product both of love and editorial rigor. Bowdoin's intention is to apply its share of sales proceeds towards further conservation of the original volumes. As you determine to acquire your own copy, or to gift one to your best friend or loved one, know that you are also playing an important part in keeping Kate Furbish's legacy, her magnificent, beautiful Maine flora, alive for future generations to pore over and enjoy.
Doing this project has been wonderful and meeting many new people, and one of those people is Melissa Cullina, who is our next speaker. Melissa is the Director of Education and Staff Botanist at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. She is also Research Associate at Polly Hill Arboretum, where she is collaborating on the flora of Martha's Vineyard and the Elizabeth Islands. Her professional specialties include rare species conservation, aquatic plants, and the flora of New England's coastal plain. Excuse me. Formerly botanist and conservation biologist for the Massachusetts National Heritage and Endangered Species Program. She has also served on the editorial board of the botanical journal Rhodora. She holds an MS in botany from the University of Maine and a BS in forest biology from the University of Vermont. In her spare time, she serves on the board of Southport Junior Yacht Club Sailing Foundation and is a volunteer and judge excuse me, for the Lincoln Academy debate team. A native of Mount Desert Island, she and her husband, author and horticulturalist Bill Cullina. Bill, are you here now? Oh, hi, there's Bill. Are raising their 3 children on Southport Island. Melissa?
Well, hello, everyone. I just want to start by thanking you all for inviting me to participate in the celebration this afternoon and to talk about one of my favorite ladies of all time, a true heroine of mine. And it's been just such a pleasure and a privilege to be involved in this project and to collaborate with Rowman and Littlefield and Bowdoin College on this project. So thank you once again. So people who know me well know that I'm a longtime Furbish fan. And in fact, one of the first things I did as a new Director of Education and Staff Botanist at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens was to reach out to Richard Lindemann to see if we could put together an exhibit of Kate Furbish's beautiful and scientifically accurate watercolors for our new education center there. And we did. We conceived the project and we brought it together. Botanical illustrations of Kate Furbish featuring the plants of Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. So we selected from her voluminous collection of watercolor images to select representatives of plants growing in our cultivated collection, but also on the wild areas of our property. And so then, as now, I really feel that sharing Furbish's story, her incredible work, is just a perfect alignment with our mission at Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, where we really strive to inspire meaningful connections between people and plants, and especially plants in Maine. So you can see the instant tie-in for both that exhibit and the book project that we're here to celebrate today. I would just add that I think Kate Furbish did so much in her lifetime to foster those kind of meaningful connections between people and plants. And that through her extensive herbarium collections and her over 1,300 watercolor illustrations of the plants of Maine, she continues to foster meaningful connections between people and plants. And I think through the publication of this important new work, she'll continue to be able to make those kind of connections for people. And I'm just so excited that her vision of being able to introduce new students of botany to the plants of Maine will be made even easier and more accessible through the publication of this book. I think she would be so thrilled. Oops. So here's the lady of the hour, Kate Furbish, and again, a heroine of mine. She certainly is a legend in botanical circles and natural history circles in Maine and beyond. And I would say she's even legendary in women's history circles. She, what a lady. A traditional Victorian lady, but with a twist. She had a strong sense of adventure, as you've heard from Jed. She traversed the bogs, and she scaled the mountains and visited the shores and the valleys and the fields and the meadows all across the great state of Maine. She was so courageous, intrepid, determined, focused, so brilliant, really, in her way. She was a true scholar, and she devoted her life to seeing, collecting, studying, and illustrating Maine's wild flora. She had a fierce love of family, and also her friends, her church, her community, and her state. But the passion that really consumed her was her drive to see and collect and paint the flora of Maine. And she did this over decades of her long life. She started in her mid-30s and continued on into her 70s. And she continued botanizing even a little bit into her 80s. And she had a very long life. She lived to be almost 100 years old. And friends said that she could read the very fine print of Gray's Manual of Botany even without glasses. At that advanced age, and I can tell that I'm not going to make it to do such. And I see a number of you out here in the room who know just how fine the print is in Gray's Manual of Botany. How I would have loved to have known her, to have learned from her, to have botanized with her. Although she really did prefer to botanize alone. She liked to see, and people in the field with her liked to talk. And she just couldn't be bothered with that. But I might have been able to convince her to go out a few times. But I missed her by just 40 years. I was born 40 years almost exactly after she died. And I confess sometimes I do try to channel her when I'm out in the field. Talk to her from time to time. I haven't resorted to Ouija yet, although I did visit Spirit Halloween with my son last week over at Cook's Corner, and we noted the Ouija boards there, and I hatched an idea, so maybe this October. So this is Kate Furbish's neighborhood when she was a girl. She was born in 1834. She was the only daughter of Benjamin and Mary Lane Furbish, and they moved to Brunswick from New Hampshire when she was less than a year old. They moved to O'Brien Street, which is now called Cumberland Street, and her father had a thriving hardware store in the neighborhood. Here's another image of O'Brien Street at the time in the 1850s when Kate Furbish lived there. I want to thank the Pejipscot Historical Society for their help with these images. Also, just to evoke the era, I wanted to show an image of Kate Furbish's brother, John, and his wife, Maria. I believe John was one of the founders of the Pejipscot Historical Society. And this is her other living brother, Frank Furbish, and he's studying something in his bedroom there. She did have another brother, Edward, who did not survive. He tragically drowned in a swimming accident in the Androscoggin River, so that was very, very sad. But here's Kate as a young woman, and I do love this image of her. We know that as a young person, she attended a private school in Brunswick where she studied, along with the regular subjects, French and Latin and a little botany. And we know that botany was a popular subject for young ladies at that time. It was considered an acceptable science for females. And so she did learn a little botany as a young person. Her father really encouraged her interest in botany by teaching her the names of the wildflowers that were growing locally around Brunswick. And obviously her passion for botany as a young person really bloomed as she grew into an older adult. Let's see. So as a young person, she made some collections around the vicinity of Brunswick. And if you're not familiar with herbarium specimens, they are pressed and dried plant specimens that are then glued onto a standard size sheet of archival paper and then stored in museum quality cabinets for posterity. And so during research for this book, I was so delighted to discover that there were some very early collections by Kate Furbish back in 1856. It was in May of that year, of that spring, and I'm not quite sure if she was 21 or 22 because she has a May birthday, May 19th. But there she was out observing and collecting the spring blooms. She collected in her travels that spring this plant here, which is the Dwarf Ginseng, Panax Trifolium. She also collected a trout lily and a blooming shad bush. And I would love to learn more about the provenance of this particular collection and how it came to be at the University of Maine. That will have to be for another lecture, but it's intriguing. It's not her typical label. Most of her labels state that it was a gift to the New England Botanical Club in 1908. So this is an entirely different group of collections that really demonstrate that, yes, in her early years, she was interested in botany and even out collecting and making formal scientific herbarium specimens. And there's that dwarf ginseng as you would have seen it in the low woods around Brunswick. I want to thank my friend Dawn Cameron for the photo. We know that her favorite botanical manual was How Plants Grow by Asa Gray, which was published in the 1850s. And we know that it was her favorite manual because she recommended it to others in letters, particularly recommending it to young people. And I have a copy of it here. It's a little more well-worn compared to the image on the screen there, but you can see its approximate size. And, as Jed mentioned, she really was a self-taught botanist. And in today's day and age, when we have any number of manuals and illustrated field guides and online websites and even apps for your phone, it's amazing to think that Kate Furbish used this book to teach herself the science that she came to know so thoroughly and completely. And I would be very daunted if I thought I had to learn the entire flora of Maine using just this book by Asa Gray. But she was a big fan of it and used it, and I like to imagine her tucking it into her skirts as she went out on her forays around her local environs. Later, when she was a bit older, in her 30s, she visited family that she had in Boston on Hudson Street, and this was after the end of the Civil War. And I think she probably took a hiatus from her botanizing habits during the Civil War. It was such a disruptive time for everyone, and she did do her part by making bandages for wounded soldiers and also visiting sick and wounded soldiers where they were in Augusta. And that was at the time her father was serving in the Maine state legislature. But after the war was over, she went to Boston to visit her family. She really just did love her family and visited them often in many different areas of the Northeast. And so on this particular stay with family, she was enrolled in a very serious art class. And we see her emerging as a serious artist at this time. And her cousins and family all remark on how she spends the better part of every day perfecting her skills in art. even though at this time she becomes plagued with neuralgia, which really bothered her in her hands and her feet. And she pressed on even through her discomfort in order to really practice her artistic skills while she had the opportunity. She also happened to attend a series of lectures for teachers in Boston by Professor George L. Goodale, who is another of Maine's early botanists. He was a native of Maine as well, and as a young man, he was hired by the state to develop a checklist of plants for the state of Maine. And during his time in Boston here, he did go on to teach at Harvard University. He offered this course for teachers, which Furbish enrolled in. And friends of Kate's have written that it really rekindled her interest in botany. And I would say not only did it rekindle it, but it raged into a blazing bonfire because her passion for the subject of botany and then art converged together in such a meaningful way during this period of her life in her mid to late 30s. And then in about the year 1870, we really see her emerge as a purposeful artist and young botanist who is coming into her own. Here she is pictured in her bedroom studio. You can see she's doing a botanical illustration and she's at work. And here's another image of her leaning forward and paying attentive detail to her sketching and her painting. So Furbish really launched her great concept of the Maine flora, as she titled it, in this year of 1870, and it was a very prolific year for her, artistically speaking. I wanted to just include her illustration of the dwarf ginseng that I showed you, which we just looked at in her early botanical specimen. And I envision her thinking back on this plant and over the places that she had seen it up until that point. We know that she worked on her art in stages. As Judy and Richard mentioned, she did sometimes, or often really, include different phenological stages of the plant in one illustration. So she would perhaps collect it in the spring when it was flowering, and then she would have to make another collection later on in the season in order to study the plant and fruit. And you can see here, she's represented the fruits of the dwarf ginseng and the flower on the same plant. And many of her illustrations are partly illustrated and partly painted. And again, I think this harkens to the fact that she did work in stages. So, of course, we cannot have a lecture about Kate Furbish without talking about the special plant that she discovered, Furbish's lousewort, Pedicularis furbishii, which she discovered in the year 1880 on a botanical foray to Van Buren and the area along the St. John River in Aroostook County. And certainly this was the way that I learned about Kate Furbish, and I think all young botanists learn about her in this way. I took a trip with the Jocelyn Botanical Society, of which I am a member, and I have several members of that society in the audience with me here today, so thank you for coming. In 1996, we took a journey to the Fort Kent region where we were able to see the Furbish's lousewort in person. And of course, that inspired a great interest in the woman who discovered the plant and her voluminous, careful, detailed work that she produced over the course of her life. And I would just point out that in that same year, my mother gave me Ada and Frank Graham's wonderful biography of Kate Furbish, which then, of course, fueled my fire and learning and interest in Kate Furbish, the person, and in her botanical work. So I just want to thank you, Ada and Frank, for this wonderful biography. And anyone who's interested in the work of Kate Furbish, you really must read this book. You must. And even though, unfortunately, it's presently out of print, I know that it's available in many, many libraries across the state of Maine. So this is your homework after the lecture. Read for yourself this wonderful book. So back to Kate Furbish, foraying off into the wilds. Just prior to the year 1880, she had been really, I think, flexing her botanical muscles in terms of really traveling to some new areas in Maine where she'd never been before. She was starting to carefully document the plants that she saw by making herbarium collections, those mounted and pressed specimens that I showed you. She started to do this late in the 1870s. She had lost her parents, both within a very short succession of one another in 1873, and it was a terrible time for her, a very sad time. But I know that she took a lot of time in caring for her parents when they were feeble and infirm near the end of their lives. And so in some ways, I think when her parents did pass on and she moved into her own home on Lincoln Street, which is right nearby O'Brien Street, she was able to live life a little bit more on her own terms and had the flexibility and means to travel more throughout the state, and so she did do so. So traveling to northern Maine in those days, can you just imagine traveling by train and by stage and then perhaps on foot to get to some of these wild areas to see these plants she'd never been able to see before, and to explore these wild territories of Maine that were really quite remote in those days. I mean, think of everything she did in her life. I mean, can you just imagine if she had a Jeep or even a pair of pants, for heaven's sakes? She would put us all to shame. She did, even in her long skirts. So in her travels along the St. John River, she discovered this very unusual plant that she'd never seen before. And even in her journals from that summer, she wrote species nove, period, like new species in her book, thinking, this could be something new. And when she sent the specimens to be studied at Harvard by Professor Serena Watson, they did in fact determine that it was a new species, and the species was named Pedicularis furbishii for its discoverer, Kate Furbish. Here's an image of Furbish's lousewort in its habitat along the St. John River. And I should mention that it is endemic to the St. John River in Maine and New Brunswick. It's a very special and very, very rare species. It's one of the few plants in Maine that's on the federal endangered species list, and as such has protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act. It's listed as federally endangered. It is adapted to the specific river shore settings along the St. John River. Its habitat is kept open by the ice scour that happens when the ice breaks up on the river every spring, and the ice flows move along the river shore there. And that keeps back the higher shrubs, such as the shrub willows and the alders. It's a hemiparasitic plant, at least in the seedling stage of its life cycle, which means that it's depending in part for food resources from neighboring plants. It's only partly parasitic. It does generate its own food through photosynthesis as well, and you'll see that in its green leaves. So sorry, there's the botanical educator popping out for just one moment. Here's Kate Furbish's illustration of the Furbish's lousewort. So then my dilemma was thinking, what of all of her 1,300 plus images that she created, which to share? There's so many. And I think what I need to do is just acknowledge that everyone needs to look through the book or even get a copy for yourself. It's so wonderful to see all of her amazing images from all across the state of Maine. So I thought I would indulge and show you first a favorite of mine. This is the purple flowering raspberry, and this illustration, Richard, do you recall, was in our exhibit at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, and we have it growing in our children's garden there. This is Rubus odoratus, and you'll see in her characteristic way she's captured both the flower and the fruit of the plant. And then I wanted to show you a close-up image of her label. Rubus odoratus, named by Linnaeus, abbreviated L, and she saw this plant in Lewiston, East Livermore, on Great Diamond Island, and also in South Poland. Oh, and also Brunswick in those years. And that's what the plant looks like in life. Not only did she seek, collect, and draw these showy species. And let me just show you her botanical specimen. Oh, and I love this one because it was in East Livermore, just as she said she found it in East Livermore. Maine flora, Androscoggin County, valley of the Androscoggin River, Rubus odoratus, collected by Kate Furbish in 1894. Many of her illustrations can be linked back to a botanical specimen that must have helped her in illustrating the plant. It's really exciting to be able to make those kind of linkages. So not only did she study, paint, collect these showy species, she also had an eye for the obscure and the hard to find. Now here's a plant maybe only a mother could love, I don't know. It's certainly more diminutive. It's called mare's tail. And though it's called common mare's tail, it's anything but common in Maine. It's actually quite hard to find in muddy, shallow waters. You'll see that she has done a beautiful rendering of the plant, and then look at the detailed anatomical drawings that she included of its very tiny flowering parts. She discovered this plant in St. Francis in 1881, South Poland in 1893, and Rangeley in 1894. And that's what it looks like in life. It just really shows to me that she was looking at everything. She really was such a comprehensive botanist, and I love that about her. It really inspires me to look across all the different kinds of plants and all the different groups. You know, oftentimes in botany we really get very highly specialized in a particular family or group, but not Miss Furbish. She took on the entire flora. I love that about her. Here's her specimen. Isn't it lovely? So this is her collection, and I enlarged the label. You can see this is the one, as she noted on her illustration, that she found in St. Francis in 1881. And as with most of her collections, this specimen belongs to the New England Botanical Club. She was such an accomplished woman. She really was. And more over time, as she progressed in her life, she became regarded as a serious member of the scientific community in botany. And one of the first signs of this is when she was appointed to be the botanist at the Poland Springs House. And she was brought on in order to teach the guests and visitors to the Poland Spring House all about the plants and flowers of the region. And remember, at that time, and we'll see this so vividly in the exhibit we're about to see after the presentations today, but botany was all the rage at that time. So she lived in a great era for studying plants. So her charge was to lead field walks. She even created an herbarium collection for the Poland Spring House so that she could document the flora of the local region and teach others about the plants that were growing in the environs. So in addition to having an actual appointment as a botanist, she also lectured to the very highly regarded Portland Society of Natural History. And this is an image of the building that unfortunately is no longer standing, where the society held their meetings during her lifetime. She also contributed to knowledge included in the Portland Catalog of Maine Plants, which was, one edition of it was authored by her friend and colleague, Linderman. She helped found the Jocelyn Botanical Society of Maine, that august body which a number of us in the audience belong to. And we're so grateful for her for helping to found that society. We still continue to have meetings and enjoy trips together throughout the state of Maine. And she did found that in collaboration with another group of botanists from her time, including Merit Lindenfernald. And she was elected as one of the first vice presidents of the society, and she even served as its president in 1911 and 1912. So you see, she was very highly regarded by her peers. And if my eyes don't deceive me, I believe this is Miss Furbish sitting right here in the front row. I believe her to be the first woman to ever publish in the journal Rhodora, a journal of the New England Botanical Club. She definitely did publish in volume 1 in 1899. And this was at a time when women weren't even allowed to be members of the New England Botanical Club. So she published about Myosotis Cullina in Maine, and that is one of the forget-me-nots, and she's reporting a new station of that plant which had not been seen in our area before. How cool is she? So all throughout these times and her botanical accomplishments and her growth and her correspondence in botanical circles was all growing. She was amassing a massive collection of these botanical herbarium specimens. And in 1908, the same year she gifted her watercolor illustrations to Bowdoin, she also gifted her large collection of herbarium specimens to the New England Botanical Club. And this is undoubtedly because of her close ties with Merritt Lindenfernald, who was a professor at Harvard and who helped her get her specimens in order, much as he helped with the labeling of the plant illustrations. One remarkable thing that's turned up over the course of this project, it was thought that she had produced about 4,000 sheets of plant specimens, and I do believe that was about the size of her gift to the New England Botanical Club in 1908. But through a recent project that digitized herbarium specimens and databases collections across many different herbaria in the Northeast, we've realized that she collected and made over 8,000 specimens. I've collected a paltry 2,000 specimens, and I'm mid-career, so I better hop to it if I'm going to be keeping up with Miss Kate. So just a vast gift to the botanical community, really, because these specimens continue to be studied and used in taxonomic and ecological research. It was really a meaningful effort that she put forth in order to give this gift of her specimens. My husband Bill knows how much time it takes to make them and what a tremendous mess it makes in the house when you're putting them all together. Of course, as we've heard from others, she did gift her collection of illustrations to Bowdoin College in 1908, and thank goodness that she did, because they've been kept in wonderful condition here in the archives of the Special Collections Department at Bowdoin. And I just do think that Kate Furbish would be so appreciative that really her mission in creating the Maine flora, which was to educate future generations of botanists about the plants of Maine, I think she would just be so thrilled to know that her vision is becoming an even greater reality than she probably ever would have perceived, and that through the publication of this book, her work can be more greatly appreciated, and students can use the book to learn about these many plants across the state of Maine. And I will say that I taught an introduction to the Maine flora class this year, and for the first time I was able to utilize Kate Furbish's drawings to illustrate what the plants that I was teaching looked like. And it was such a joy to be able to use Kate Furbish's images in my classes at the Botanical Gardens, and I know I will definitely continue to do that well into the future. And this project made that possible. So I just want to close with a short anecdote. Recently, my husband Bill and I were invited to go out to Squirrel Island, which is just off Boothbay Harbor near where we live, to lead a plant walk and help them create a list of plants on their island. And it was getting toward the end of the day, and we were naming this plant and naming that plant and telling them all about the native and invasive plants there on Squirrel Island. And one of the last plants of the day that we saw was this one. And I looked at it and I said, I just don't see that plant very often. I think it might be the sea beach dock, but I'm not quite sure. It's kind of uncommon in Maine, and I had learned about it when working in Massachusetts at the Endangered Species Program, where it's considered a threatened plant and really hardly never seen. So I was excited, and with permission from the leaders of our group, I took a small specimen for my plant press to make a voucher specimen. And when I got home, I got right on that digitized database I was telling you about with all the herbarium specimens in it to see whether anyone else might have ever collected it from Squirrel Island. And lo and behold, Kate Furbish had been to Squirrel Island and had collected the very same plant. Who knows, perhaps at the very same beach. So I got all excited. Bill, you have to see this. Kate Furbish collected the sea beach dock Rumex pallidus right from Squirrel Island also in 1892. Her specimen looks a little bedraggled. I envision in my mind that she had it out to draw it, to study it, before she got around to pressing it. And here's her close-up label. And this also belongs to the New England Botanical Club, so credits to them for the images. Rumex pallidus, Squirrel Island, August 2nd, 1892. And lo and behold, she was there with my other favorite botanist, Lindemann, her good friend. And his specimen does look quite a bit better, doesn't it? He probably got his right into the press without attempting to illustrate it whatsoever. So after confirming that, yes, this is the plant I had found, and that, yes, it had been seen from Squirrel Island before, I then, of course, had to go right to my volume of the Plants and Flowers of Maine to check on Kate Furbish's beautiful illustration of the plant. And there it is, the sea beach dock. And so you see, her work still has so much meaning today. She still inspires we botanists today. And just what a privilege, what a huge privilege to be involved in this project and to be able to participate in raising awareness about Kate Furbish, her life, and her tremendous work. So thank you so very much. I would like to just make a few acknowledgments. I would like to thank the Consortium of Northeastern Herbaria for the images of all those voucher specimens that you saw. Of course, Ada and Frank Graham for helping really get me so interested in Kate Furbish as a young person. Don Cameron from the Maine Natural Areas Program for reviewing my introduction. And I should mention that Ada and Frank were also kind enough to review my introduction for me before publication. I would like to thank Judy Montgomery, Kat Stefko from the library, Richard Lindemann, who invited me to be part of this project in the first place. Thank you, Richard. He could tell I was a Furbish fan from the first day he met me. Of course, the Pajepskit Historical Society, William Cullina, the Harvard Botany Libraries for the image of the Jocelyn Botanical Society members in 1902. Of course, the Jocelyn Botanical Society itself, for which I'm a proud member, and also the New England Botanical Club. So thank you once again. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. We're going to get set up for questions and answers now, so if you give us just a moment. But I did want to let you know that this event was live streamed, but has also been taped so that it will be available on the Bowdoin website under Bowdoin Talks. So if you have friends that weren't able to make it today, or if you'd like to go back and hear something again, you can go right on to Bowdoin Talks. It usually takes a day or two to get set up. So let's give our guests just a moment, but I did want to remind you that immediately after our question and answer, we hope that you'll join us on the second floor of the Hawthorne-Longfellow Library for our reception and celebration of the book, and also the opening of Botanizing America, our new exhibit. Now we have two wonderful people in the audience that have mics, and so if you'd like to speak, if you would raise your hand, and then someone will come with a mic to you. We especially want to get this because it will be recorded. We want your question to be recorded, and then you can speak directly to the speakers.
Thank you, all of you. I have a question I'm addressing to each one of you. If you had a chance to ask Kate Furbish a question today, if she were in front of you, what would you ask?
Would you like to join us for dinner?
I think I'd really love to ask her sort of what her favorite botanical adventure was, and to have her describe it to me in her own words, because, you know, I've imagined so many of them in my mind, and I do study her specimens and her illustrations so much, and I imagine in my mind what it must have been like for her, And to be out there with the high boots and the long skirts and how she managed that, but really what her favorite botanical adventure was over the course of her really long life.
I guess I'd be curious to know what was her favorite part of Maine, and why did she love that particular part of Maine?
Hold on, somebody will come with a mic.
Did she keep a journal or a diary?
She did. And some of them are still preserved. And Ada and Frank really quote from them quite extensively in the biography that they've written. And so we are able to get glimpses, quite vivid glimpses, into her life in certain periods where her diaries and journals do persist.
I can add to that many of her papers are scattered, and there aren't a great many of them anywhere. We certainly have the scrapbooks, some small group of correspondence, a few images. Melissa has researched her here and there and understands the arduous task of trying to figure out all the different places where her collection exists. One of the great drives for digitizing manuscript materials nowadays is to be able to provide some unified way to draw all of those disparate pieces together. And that's always the great hope, that eventually it'll all get online and you won't have to travel 16 different places in order to see the whole thing.
Melissa, can you tell us what church Kate Furbish attended in Brunswick, and which house on Lincoln Street did she live in?
Sure. I believe her parents belonged to the Congregational Church, but I think she related most closely with the Episcopalian Church. Do you agree with that, Ada and Frank? Yes. And I don't know the street address off the top of my head on Lincoln Street. I'm sorry, I'd have to look that up.
Interested in the quality of the reproductions. How much of that was dependent upon digitization? How much on the printer? Was there any enhancement or restoration required to the finished product? And where do you find a very good printer that can do that kind of work?
Well, it starts with the quality of the scans, the reproduction of the images, the very high resolution imaging that was accomplished painstakingly by the college. And the reproduction by the printer, I think, is first rate. We used a printer in Asia that is known for doing high quality color work, coffee table books, and we're very pleased with how it came out.
If Kate was an amateur and was not sponsored by a college, a museum, anyone like that, she must have lived from her parents' income, and they must be due some recognition for supporting her through her long life. Is that correct?
It's my understanding that that's the case, that she was allowed to, or if she was able to set up housekeeping on her own after her parents had passed away. Certainly, she was close with her brother, John Furbish, who took over the hardware store business from their father, and I know he did assist her in finding that home on Lincoln Street, and I'm guessing that if she had ever been in financial need, her extensive and large family would be right there for her. So. But my understanding is that she was able to live independently because of the inheritance she received from her parents, yes.
I'm curious to know if any of the 1,300 images or plants that she illustrated if are extinct now, or if they're just some that are endangered. Are there any that can't be found in the state anymore?
And that's an interesting question, and one I don't think I know the answer to right off the top of my head. I think there may be stories around plants such as that. If that were the case, certainly some may be considered extirpated from the state of Maine, but not extinct across their range.
Can we have one more question?
Can I ask a question?
Richard.
Please, may I please ask a question, Madam Secretary? This question has been asked of me, and I have no idea of knowing how to proceed, but maybe you do. What percentage of the plants in Maine that you think might have been extant then were actually collected by Kate Furbish?
Oh, that is a great question. And because our flora is dynamic, it's one that's really tricky to answer because, of course, species move into the state over time. Fewer leave the state, but it's more we're gaining new species all the time from different introductions. So not knowing exactly how many were here at that time, it's really tough to answer the question, but I will say she did collect even more extensively than she drew. That is, she collected in groups that she didn't illustrate. She collected numerous specimens of grasses and sedges and ferns, which she didn't necessarily illustrate. I think she collected a very high proportion of what was growing in the state of Maine at the time of her life. But I would love to run the numbers and come up with a more specific answer.
You have the rest of your career, so.
Thank you all very much. And please join me in thanking our speakers, Jed Lyons, Melissa Cullina, and Richard Lindemann. Before you leave, or when you get over to the reception, please take a look at the book. It is absolutely gorgeous. And if you are so inclined, take one home with you. Thanks so much for coming.